Well, speaking of covenants kept, God kept his covenant. I blessed you with Isaac. Will you keep yours, Abraham? Namely, doing anything and everything I ask of you? Will you submit your will? In this case, will you submit your son? Will you submit your joy and all claim you have to it and lay it upon an altar of sacrifice to be consumed back into the tragedy of tears? We're going back to this challenge. What kind of a story is this? Is it a tragedy or a comedy? Well, we take a tragic turn, but we'll still end up laughing. I promise you'll end up with an Isaac to laugh over. So 22, verse 1. It came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham yet again. And that word tempt, bad translation, it means to test or to try or to prove. And he says to him, Abraham, and Abraham said, behold, here I am. Or to rephrase it, behold, here am I, as the Lord said when God asked for a volunteer in premortality. So many parallels we'll see. Verse 2, God says, take now thy son, thine only son, Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. That's it. Pretty sparse statement, but loaded with meaning as well as packed with pain. Meaning, thy son, but then he says, thine only son? Wait a minute, you know I have Ishmael, that was a miracle child too. I know, but as far as the covenant is concerned, you only have one. And honestly, as far as I'm concerned, God, as far as the covenant is concerned for me, I only had one son also. At least one only begotten son of God in the flesh. So already we're starting to sense this story is more than just Abraham and Isaac. It's your only son, only begotten. It's the son whom thou lovest. Oh, my beloved son. Those are two phrases we do hear from God about Christ. Only begotten and beloved. Take him to a mountain. Ascend the hill of the Lord where sacrifices are to be made. Your whole life has been spent building altars. Well, come to mine. I have built an altar there. Come to this mountain and offer your son as a burnt offering. Now there's no explanation given and no explanation asked for, which is amazing to me. I'd be wondering why. There's only obedience. And in fact, there's only immediate obedience. In verse 2, he'd been told to take now thy son. And in verse 3, he does exactly that. Abraham rose up early in the morning. I imagine this is more than just immediate obedience. It was probably a sleepless night. He rose up early in the morning and saddled his ass and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son and clave the wood for the burnt offering. So he went fully intending to go through with it. He's packed it all, everything that's necessary. And he rose up and went unto the place of which God had told him. He goes. And in verse 4, on the 3rd day, there's some more symbolism. Abraham lifted up his eyes. I wonder if he had been hanging his head the entire trip. And he saw the place afar off. Not too late to turn around, Abraham. Maybe that's what he's thinking. Verse 5, Abraham said unto his young men, abide ye here with the ass, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship, and come again to you. Now, I looked up the come again because in the English, you can't tell if that's a plural or a singular verb. Is he saying, we are going to go and I will come again? But in other languages, many of them, you can tell just from the verb alone, without any pronoun needed. Are we talking plural, singular, male, female? How does this work? In the Hebrew, this is still a plural verb. That's an interesting one. So we will go and we will come again. And what will we do in between? We will worship. Do we consider our sacrifices as acts of worship? We should realize that they are. I mean, if worship is recognizing God for who he is, what better way to worship than to offer him our all? Then in 6, Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it upon Isaac his son. Can you picture Jesus bearing his own cross, the wood upon his back? Abraham took the fire in his hand and a knife, and they went both of them together. One of the things you'll notice in the Old Testament is some stories are told so sparsely, so quickly, it's like, boom, that happened, that was fast. Whereas this one is so deliberate, so painfully slow, so detailed, to force us to kind of go from phrase to phrase to phrase. Can you picture Abraham slowly just willing himself to put one foot in front of the other as he ascends this hill with the weight of the world upon his shoulders? And remember, this is Abraham representing the father and Isaac representing the son. Now that son, in verse 7, Isaac speaks to Abraham, his father, and he says, my father. And he said, here am I, my son. And Isaac says, well, behold the fire and the wood. I mean, you've put everything in order. But where is the lamb for a burnt offering? So this is confusing to him. It's like, Dad, you're detail-oriented. And you have prepared every needful thing. How could you forget the most important part? Well, little does he know. But I think we're guilty of that sometimes. of paying attention to all these peripheral details and not focusing on the Lamb of God that ties it all together. Right? Joseph Smith's famous statement. What do we believe? We believe in Jesus. We believe in crucifixion and resurrection. We believe in atonement. Everything else is just an appendage. But you want to talk about an occupational hazard of having the most amazing appendages on earth, it's being a Latter-day Saint and losing focus on Christ. I hope we can hear Isaac asking us at the end of any talk or any lesson, any activity, wow, you taught amazing things, or we had a lot of fun, and look at all the wood and the knife and all these things, but where was the lamb in all of that? You taught me a lot of great peripheral principles. Teach me Jesus. Help me find him. Where is this lamb? Verse 8, Abraham responds, my son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So they went, both of them together. Now, the English can be confusing because it sounds almost too good to be true. He's going to provide himself as a lamb. And that is true. That is exactly what happens with the atonement and crucifixion of Jesus. But the original, the real way it's said, is simply that God himself will provide the lamb. And that's exactly what the Father does. Whom shall I send? Oh, him whom I love. And I will send him to die for all of you others whom I love as well. Verse 9, they came to the place which God had told him of. And Abraham built an altar there, and he laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. Again, think this through as slowly as you can, because I'm sure that's what's happening with Abraham. Now here again, realize what's going on in Abraham's mind and heart, and what's going on in Isaac's, because now he realizes, wait a minute, I'm the sacrifice. I'm the lamb that God has provided. Now, we don't exactly know how old he is, but according to some traditions, he's definitely old enough. I mean, if he can carry all the wood up, is he old enough to fight back? Or is he at least old enough to flee? I mean, fight or flight is going to kick in big time once he realizes, wait a minute, what are you doing, Dad? What is God asking of us, of me? I said before that God will test this family from every angle. Abraham, I'm going to test you about your wife as well as about your son. Sarah, I'm going to test you about your own virtue. Isaac, I'm going to test you about your own life and how much you trust your earthly father or your heavenly Father. Are you willing to lay down your life as a willing sacrifice? Because it can't be done against your will. It's not being done against Abraham's. What will you do? Another level of this painful irony is the empathy that Abraham would undoubtedly have felt for his son. Because what did we first learn about Abraham back in Abraham chapter 1? My dad tried to sacrifice me too. And I know exactly the fear and panic that is gripping your heart as you are bound down upon this altar. Mine was to false gods. Yours is to true. I know it's easy for me to say that. I hope you believe and understand that, son. I had faith that God would liberate me. I have no such expectation that he'll liberate you because he's the one that's asking me to do this. I mean, honestly, we will see later that there was no expectation on Abraham's part of a stayed hand. Son, we're going through with this. Are you ready? I pray that I am. So in verse 10, Abraham stretched forth his hand, slowly, painfully, no doubt. He took the knife to slay his son. Again, a very deliberate narrative. And then, verse 11, if we're going to speed up the film, the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. I wonder about the twice. Is he there to get his full attention? It's like, no, stop. Abraham, Abraham. And Abraham said, here am I, as I always am. The angel continues in 12, lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him, for now I know, and I know intimately, I know viscerally, I know experientially. Better yet, you do too. Omniscience coming down to see, giving us an opportunity to prove ourselves. You've proven yourself. I know thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son. Christ would be offered in the stead of every son and every daughter of God. He was the ram caught in the thicket, there trapped by his crown of thorns. No mere lamb of God, though he was that too, but a ram of God. Horns often signify authority, and there was no more regal ram than Jesus himself. But God himself offering exactly what the Father and the Son did in Gethsemane and on Calvary. It's what they've been doing ever since. Verse 14 then, Abraham called the name of that place Jehovah Jireh, as it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be seen. Jehovah Jireh means the Lord will see. The Lord will provide. I came down to see sins and cries. Well, now I came down to see sacrifice and faith, and oh, boy, was it visible. You magnified it to the point that anyone could find it there. Verse 15, then the angel of the Lord called unto Abraham out of heaven the second time, and said, by myself have I sworn, saith the Lord, for because thou hast done this thing, and hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, that in blessing I will bless thee. In multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of the heaven, and as the sand which is upon the seashore. And thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice. Oh, there's the renewal of the covenant. If many are called and few are chosen, well, maybe the first time God gave it, he was calling Abraham, and now he's fully choosing Abraham, because Abraham fully chose him. In some ways, it's fitting that the covenant would come through Isaac, and that Isaac would be the only covenant child of Abraham. Because that means all of Abraham's covenant posterity came through Isaac alone. Just like all of us can only come back to God through Jesus Christ alone. It also means that all of that covenant posterity is included, inherent in Isaac. So that by offering Isaac, I'm offering everything. I'm putting not just my son on the altar, I'm putting the whole Abrahamic covenant on the altar. God, you're asking me to do that. You're risking your word. How are you going to, okay, I trust you. And he goes through with it. There's something powerful about this, on the heels of that experience, being reminded of seed like the stars and the sands, because it's all within Isaac. And he that had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it is said that in Isaac shall thy seed be called. Now this, the way he sets this up here is really, really important. He that had received the promises offered the very personification of the promise. You see what the writer of Hebrews is trying to get us to wrestle with? It's more than just he's offering his son. It's he's offering his promise. That says something about Abraham and something about God, where it's like, whoa, God, you do realize that this is the covenant child. And if you have me slay him, then there goes the covenant. Sands of the seashore have to start with at least one grain, and he's the only grain I got. So I don't... Now, this is mere mortality speaking to omniscience, but just in case this is a blind spot, you can multiply infinity by 0 and it still ends up 0. The 0 will trump the infinity, just FYI, okay? Now, as long as there's 1, then infinity times 1 will be infinity. So if you're promising me infinity, you have to hold on to the 1. This is what I'm getting at. This is not just me trying to hold on to my son. This is me trying to help you hold on to your promise, which cannot happen if I slay your promise. Understand what we're saying here? I mean, I love the way it's set up here in Hebrews. But then the way it's described, it's now Abraham's turn to trust in the who, just like Sarah did. So he says, accounting that God, there's the ultimate who, was able to raise him up, even from the dead, from whence also he received him in a figure. Now that is mind-blowing. You understand what he just said? Abraham, like I said earlier, was fully intending to sacrifice his son. He wasn't like assuming that there's an angel waiting in the wings to come and stay the hand. It's not like, okay, I'm about to do it, God. 1, 2, a little more nervously, 2.5. No. I know this is what God is asking me to do, and I'm going to do it. Then how on earth will God keep his promise? I can only think of one possible way. Accounting that God was able to raise him up even from the dead. That's what was on Abraham's mind. I fully intend to slay my son because I have full faith that God will then raise him again. That's amazing. He wasn't waiting for an angel. He was resting on the resurrection. Wow, you understand this? He's going to raise my son. He's going to give me the power to do it. Now, where on earth would you come up with that kind of idea, let alone that kind of faith? But what? God doesn't happen. God doesn't raise the dead. He didn't raise Abel. He hasn't raised anybody. How can you possibly even think that? Well, the writer of Hebrews gave us the hint. He would raise him up even from the dead, that last phrase, from whence also he received him in a figure. Oh, wait, what? And in Romans chapter 4, we get the key that unlocks that clue. The clue was, I know God will raise him from the dead. He already has. Well, what do you mean? Isaac His whole existence is an example of life emerging out of death. We've been through it before. God proved that. And now he's just going to prove it again. I know he can bring death from life, comedy out of tragedy, because that's what an Isaac is.